Hey there, Timberwolves. Miss Robolino coming in with another review video for our exam tomorrow on February 10th, 2021, Wednesday. This review is going to go ahead and briefly go over the information you need to know for the Civil War and Reconstruction. So let's go ahead and let's dig in. So if you remember from the last unit, the road to the Civil War, we saw that there was a lot of tension between the Union and the southern states. And when we mean Union, we mean the northern states. They were different regionally as well as sectionally, which means that they viewed themselves differently with industry, they viewed themselves differently with their political ideas and their social beliefs. For example, the North was big on industry as well as against or anti-slavery, whereas the South was mainly agriculture, looking at large plantations and small farmers, where they used these plantations, and the plantations were set up and run on the success for economic success to be with slave labor. So after we start to see this tension build up and build up and build up, Abraham Lincoln is elected president in 1860, and this is the final straw that basically forces the South to decide it's time to secede. So you have right now the Union, which is going to be the northern part of the United States, including the capital in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. The southern states, which are now called the Confederate States of America, you may also know them as Confederate States, or the Confederacy. These are different words you can use. So remember, the Confederate States are going to be the South, and the Union is going to be the North. And we're going to see battles take place, and then eventually with the South losing, and we see now a reconstruction of the South, making sure that they are rewriting and changing their constitutions to be let back into the Union, which we now call the United States of America. So there were two different presidents during this time. If you remember, the Union was going to be Abraham Lincoln in 1860. He is elected. Whereas when the Confederate States of America is created, you have Jefferson Davis. Now, if you remember, Jefferson Davis was a huge plantation owner with cotton, and his wife came from Missouri with large plantations as well, where they used the Mississippi to go ahead and bring a lot of their harvest down to Louisiana harbor to go ahead and sell their cotton. So these are your two presidents. Just remember, Jefferson Davis is for the Confederate States of America after the southern states secede, and Abraham Lincoln was the president elected for the United States. So as the war begins, we start to see that there are different military leaders. So for the Confederate States, or the southern states, we have Robert E. Lee, and he is the leader for the Confederates, and a very well-talented leader, went to West Point, and very, very genius with how he handled his men in the South, as well as much experience with the U.S.-Mexican War. The North, on the other hand, was Ulysses S. Grant, who also went to West Point. And just one thing I want to point out is Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant were actually really good friends. They had a lot in common, going to the same military school in West Point, as well as fighting in the U.S.-Mexican War. So again, they were together. And this just goes to show you the Civil War is a war between, Americans that were friends, brothers, family members. So it just goes to show you how this war is and how it affects friendships as well as America as a whole. So taking it back to the beginning, firing on Fort Sumter is the first battle that starts the Civil War. Fort Sumter is in South Carolina, the first state to secede. And at this time, it was occupied by Union troops. And once South Carolina seceded, they decided to go ahead and make sure that the Union troops inside of Fort Sumter were gone because they viewed them as the enemy. Basically what happens is the Confederate States of America, the Army, basically tells them they need to leave. They tell them they're not leaving because they're waiting for orders. The Confederates give them a few hours and they don't leave. So the Confederates decide to fire on Fort Sumter. So the firing on Fort Sumter was the leads to the bloodiest war in American history, the Civil War. And this is just kind of showing you what happens. And just remember, the Confederates are over here in the front with their cannonballs, and over here behind all the smoke is Fort Sumter, and they are firing on them. So just to kind of show you, this is 1861 is when the war begins. A year after, almost a year after Abraham Lincoln is elected president of the United States. So the next battle that happens during this time is the Battle of Antietam. And this is when we start to see things really get a lot more intense. Antietam takes place in Maryland, which is very close to the District of Columbia. And this battle only lasts one day, and it is known as the single bloodiest battle in American military history. Though the Union views this as a win because of the amount of deaths and the casualties on both sides and the fact that no one was able to gain an advancement on either side, it was really more of a draw. But during this time, with the Union taking it as a win, President Abraham Lincoln decides that he's going to go ahead and start the Emancipation Proclamation. He creates this proclamation stating that all slaves in the seceding states are now free and that they can leave. The idea of this was to go ahead and create chaos in the South, hopefully ignite maybe some slave revolts, but unfortunately it doesn't work that way because many slaves were very, very scared. Some did run to the north and join the Union Army, or if the Union Army was able to come to those particular states and free specific slaves, many of them would go ahead and join the Union Army and fight for this freedom that they well deserved. So just some interesting facts for you. So at this time, you need to remember Abraham Lincoln is in a really tough position. He is president of the United States, and that includes the southern states that have left. So he views the southern states as his people. So you can imagine he does not want to go ahead and harm his people. He does want to do is bring the Union back together with the least amount of damage. And so he hires a few people to go ahead and come up with a plan. And one of these plans is going to be blockades. If you remember, a blockade is when you stop things from coming in and going out of a particular area. So it economically crushes that particular country, and it makes them weak, which means they will secede. This is something that is used in many military plans all the time. So this idea was known as the Anaconda Plan, as in like the anaconda snake. The whole point was the Union had amazing navy, and they were able to go ahead and use this on the coastline of the South, blocking ports where they can go ahead and bring in supplies as well as ship out cotton to go ahead and keep the Southern economy going. And the whole point of this was to slowly starve and crush the South so they would go ahead and surrender. This does take longer than was expected. If you kind of remember, the North thought that this war would last only a few years, but it ended up lasting 4 years and causing a lot of damage and bringing forth a lot of casualties to both the Union and the South, or the Confederate side. So that's the whole point of the Anaconda Plan. So Texas is definitely affected by the Anaconda Plan, and we're going to go ahead and kind of take a look at this with the Battle of Galveston. So if you remember, Galveston is in Texas on the port side, on the coastline in the Gulf of Mexico, and Texas is a huge producer of cotton. And they don't have much industry. So they rely on their plantations to go ahead and bring economic stability into Texas. So with the fact that Texas is very close to Mexico, they're able to go ahead and kind of create this great opportunity to economically keep themselves stable. So Galveston was the largest city in Texas at this time, and they're exporting, which means they are sending out 75% of the state's cotton. That's a lot. Abraham Lincoln at this time orders that blockade, which is that moving forward with the Anaconda Plan, to go ahead and stop this cotton from being sold and kind of being used as a way to get help from the neighbors in the South, which was Mexico. On October 1862, the Union launched an assault on Galveston Harbor, which basically allowed the Union to take over Galveston and stop this trading from going through. Another reason why that the Union wanted to go ahead and kind of stop this cotton from going was they can go ahead and take the cotton that they commandeer and use it in the North for factories to make more supplies or necessary uniforms for the fighting men in the Civil War. So it was a really good thing for the Union to do this. It had multiple benefits. Unfortunately, Texans, being Texans, were not happy with this because 75% of the state's cotton is coming from Galveston. You could imagine the economic depression that would come in Texas for this. So Galvestonians got together and they decided to load their clads, which are metal ships, with cotton really high, and they were called cotton clads. So just a few months after, in January 1863, they take these cotton clads out and they start firing on the Union ships who are patrolling the Galveston port. And it actually ends up working really well, and the Confederates or the Texans are able to go ahead and sink a lot of these ships, and then the rest just basically just retreat, allowing Texas to go ahead and reclaim its port and be able to go ahead and use it to bring in economic stability, as well as being able to ship supplies to other parts of the Confederate States of America. So this is a really important win for the Confederate States. As we start to move, the Confederates are doing really well, and one of the advantages that they have is just having great military leaders as well as great fighters, specifically looking at Robert E. Lee, well-equipped men who are involved in the Army, many who fought in the U.S.-Mexican War as well. So the Confederates, or the Southern states, have a large advantage over the Union. At this point, the Confederate states have been winning a lot of wars, and the Union is starting to get very scared, thinking that they're going to lose this Civil War, and Lincoln is very, very worried. But at this time, with changing the leader who used to be McClellan, and now it's Ulysses S. Grant, who was promoted to leader of the Union, comes in and makes this huge win in Vicksburg. So one thing you need to understand about Vicksburg is it is in Mississippi, along the Mississippi River. And if you understand, the Mississippi River is a huge transportation corridor. Basically what that means is it's a great way for people in the South to use the Mississippi River to ship cotton as well as bring in supplies into the South. So it's a big, big deal for them, specifically with economic stability. So the Union at this time thinks it's a great opportunity for them to go ahead and take Vicksburg and take control of the Mississippi, which would economically hurt the South and allow for the Union to kind of get a leg up on the battle. So this was a huge Union victory where the North was able to go ahead and take over the Mississippi River. This happened at Vicksburg, and it splits the Confederacy Army in two and makes them weak, and they're not able to go ahead and kind of bring back that strength that they had. So that's just something really important to understand. And this siege happened around July 1863, which is coincidentally around the same time as Gettysburg, just a day before. So Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania, and if you kind of know your U.S. geography, Pennsylvania is not that far from Virginia. So this is getting really scary for the Union because now the Confederates are inside Union territory, and they're just getting closer to the capital, which is kind of where they're going to win. So if you remember in class, I gave you an example of the Civil War. It's just this big game of capture the flag, where the Confederates, their job is to get to the Union capital, which is in Washington, D.C., so they could win, whereas the Union's job is to get to the capital of the Confederacy, which is in Richmond, Virginia, and kind of take over that capital so they could win. So this is just kind of the idea of what's happening. So Robert E. Lee is commanding this regiment of Southern troops, whereas Ulysses S. Grant is commanding the Union Army. And Gettysburg is a 3-day battle that ends in the bloodiest battle overall in the Civil War. And it is a huge, significant win for the Union and is a turning point for the Union to kind of go ahead and move forward and take control, to be able to push the Union Army back in, to push the Union Army into the South and push the Confederacy back into the Southern states. So on day 1, there was a huge, large loss of life. Day 2, the Confederates were able to coordinate attacks that resulted in high casualties on both sides. And if you remember, the Union is able to go ahead and spare more lives because they have a larger population, whereas the Confederates, not so much. They're very limited on what they have. Day 3 of fighting consisted of an attack with General Lee, was able to go ahead and, push his troops forward. But unfortunately, it doesn't really work well because the Union defenses were able to go ahead and just be stronger. And the loss from this last state of the battle significantly hurt this regiment for the Confederacy, that Lee had no choice but to surrender or withdraw. It became the bloodiest overall battle, leading with high casualties and shocking the nation on how bad it was. In fact, Abraham Lincoln gives his Gettysburg address in Gettysburg, basically just saying that this is just not going to happen. The Union is going to stay strong. We're going to come together. This is not how we're going to push forward, that, these men who have fought will not die in vain, and so on and so forth. It's an amazing speech, and I do encourage you to take a look at it on the virtual exhibit that is left on Canvas. So as the Union starts to progress further and further, the Anaconda Plan is starting to go ahead and see some effects in 1863 and to 1865. Texas, again, fighting for their life, looking at them as cotton being their main economic stability and their only way of work inside of Texas. The North is trying to go ahead and take over ports in particular areas, specifically in Louisiana and Texas. And this is around the Sabine River, which is the dividing river between Texas and Louisiana. So because of Texas's proximity or closeness to Mexico, it allowed the Confederacy to be able to trade with neighboring countries, such as Mexico, to go ahead and get supplies, military supplies, food, anything that would help the Confederates continue on in this fight. Lincoln was very afraid of an alliance between Texas, or the Confederate States of America, and Mexico. So he basically had this idea to continue the Anaconda Plan and just stop all trading from this area. Unfortunately, the Union's goal was to go ahead and cut off the railroad line inside of Texas, Louisiana, to prevent, supplying the Confederate troops in the East Coast. But, taking a look at the battle on the bottom, the Confederates, only being 46 of them, are able to go ahead inside the fort and push away the Union Navy, shooting at them and basically just not allowing a victory. So the Confederates stationed there were ready and were aware of what was happening and fired upon disabling and capturing those Union forces and making it a huge Confederate victory, which I do believe would, if it was a loss, it significantly would have and possibly ended the war soon. Taking a look towards the end and fighting continuing on for 4 years, Lee has finally surrendered in the East Coast, but because of news traveling so slow and not having the technology that we have today, fighting continued at least 2 months after April of 1865 when Lee surrendered. An example of this is the last battle in Texas at Palmito Ranch, which is in southern Texas by Brownsville. The battle is considered the last clash between Union and Confederate forces in Texas. It took place along the Rio Grande, right by Brownsville. The battle was considered a Confederate victory, but because Lee already surrendered, there was no help or way to go ahead and continue fighting. So this just kind of was like the last battle altogether inside of Texas. So just kind of going back and looking at the advantages and disadvantages. I mentioned some earlier through the battles, but I want to take the opportunity just to kind of go through them. So remembering the Confederate South had huge advantages. Majority of the wars were fought in the South, so they knew their terrain, having a home front advantage. They had better military leaders and actually a lot better soldiers who knew how to fight. They had help from civilians in the South who were supporting their cause. And if you remember, the South is really fighting for their economic stability and their freedom in their ideas. If you remember, the Confederate States of America, the people there viewed themselves as revolutionaries because they were fighting a tyrant, which was the United States, because they wanted to be their own country. The Confederate disadvantages is so many, and this is one of the reasons why the war was able to, go in the North's way as winning, is that the South didn't have a really good Navy. It was underdeveloped. They had a small population. Majority of the population in the South was actually slaves, but the slaves all of them were not fighting for the South. We also see that there was little industry to help with weapons and food. So many of the people fighting in the South starved to death if there were blockades or railroads taken over by Union regiments. They just weren't able to go ahead and be taken care of. So this put a big damper on the South's ability to fight. The South also had poor transportation, not a lot of railroads. Many of them were privately owned, which meant that they were used for one thing, to be able to transport specific things like cotton or slaves or anything that would help the plantation. So the railroads never interconnected to be able to go ahead and move people around. Whereas the North, the railroads were a huge advantage because they interconnected with all the industry in the North and kind of moving things around from cities and ports and canals. The North had a way better Navy that was able to go ahead and, execute blockades around the coast. They had better transportation with railroads, which was able to go ahead and ship supplies, carry men faster and more efficiently, as well as sending food, which is a big, important thing. The North also had more industries, and they were able to make better and more weapons at the time, as well as make supplies and food. So this was a huge advantage for the North. And the North, on the other hand, also had a bigger population because of highly dense cities, and they were able to kind of refresh troops as men started to get very sick or were casualties of war. So the North was able to go ahead and ship men down really fast with railroads and other forms of transportation. The Union did have disadvantages. One was many of the men were not really good fighters. Many of them never been to war. They did not know the terrain in the South. Their military leaders were subpar of the Confederacy. The Union soldiers had to deal with Southern civilians helping the Confederate soldiers, so they were not always getting correct information. And sometimes the civilians of the South would also engage in, not helping the Union soldiers to take over the Confederates. So here's just a picture just showing you the railroads, and you can kind of take a look right here looking at the North when you see all of these interconnecting railroads, specifically around transportation corridors, the Great Lakes, looking at Northeast where there's a lot of industry in New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And then you take a look at the South where we see a lot of these railroads just kind of are not connecting at all, and it makes it really hard for the South to be able to use them. So this is just a picture of the Appomattox, Virginia, or known as the Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee in Virginia is fighting with Ulysses S. Grant. And unfortunately, due to the lack of men fighting, they try to retreat back to the Confederacy. But unfortunately, the Union troops are able to cut them off. And Lee, just seeing no point of continuing, decides to surrender, ending the war of the Civil War. Some interesting facts about this is that Lee and Ulysses, like I said before, were really good friends. In fact, they chatted a bit before they went ahead and started going over the surrender terms. In fact, they went to a private house to sit down in the parlor and just kind of discuss and talk things out, and really just very cordial. It was very nice. So this happened on April 9th, 1865. At this time, Lincoln was very excited for the win and wanted to get straight away into reconnecting the Union and the Confederacy together to become the United States again. Unfortunately, due to circumstances, Lincoln was assassinated about 5 days after Lee's surrender to the Union. And he was killed by John Wilkes Booth in a play in the Ford's Theater, and Lincoln was sadly shot in the back of the head, where Wilkes Booth ran away and was found and later shot and killed. So this was a very sad day for the country. So Lincoln was assassinated on the 14th and died on the 15th. Because Lincoln died, the next successor would be his vice president, which was Andrew Johnson. But just to kind of quickly go over what we're talking about and what we're looking at specifically, Lincoln had a construction plan, and his construction plan was pretty simple. Get the country back together. That's what he wanted to focus on. He wanted to unify the country and then deal with other issues as they come. So the southern states had to create new state governments, basically pledging their loyalty to the Union and abolishing slavery altogether. Unfortunately, due to Lincoln's assassination, he was not able to go ahead and see this through. But his predecessor, Andrew Johnson, went ahead and went through with Lincoln's plan and basically shifted control in the South to small farmers and laborers, keeping in mind that these small farmers and laborers were definitely in the understanding of they did not want the newly freed enslaved people to go ahead and enjoy their freedoms. So many of them went ahead and were able to go ahead and create a society where the white population was able to go ahead and restore their superiority over the African American community. So this was definitely a negative inside of the Reconstruction of the South. As the new states started to come in and they started to go ahead and recreate their constitutions, many of the communities, the white communities in the South, made it very difficult for the Black communities to go ahead and practice their newly earned freedoms, such as Black codes, Jim Crow laws, and restricted the abilities of African Americans to practice their civil and political rights, which then leads to Johnson being impeached and the radical Republicans coming in, and they decide to be a little bit more strict with the South and how they come back into the Union. So the radical Republicans decide to divide the South into 5 military districts, taking away the control from the small farmers and the laborers. And they're very upset about this because now they no longer have control. And now we're seeing more federal presence inside the South, which is completely what they are against. If you remember from the prior unit, the South was more about state rights and less federal control. At this time, these new state constitutions had to be written, and they had to go ahead and include the 14th and 15th Amendment. If you remember, the 13th Amendment frees the African American slaves. The 14th Amendment gives the African American citizenship, and the 15th Amendment allows them to go ahead and vote. Congress was then able to go ahead inside the radical Republicans, able to start the Freemen's Bureau, which assisted new newly freed slaves in getting land and receiving education to be able to better themselves in the American society. So I just wanted to quickly go over these amendments that were ratified into the new states' constitutions in the South. The 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery inside of the USA and all its territories. A huge impact of this is that the plantation system is completely obliterated, because if you remember, plantation system is based off of slave labor. The 14th Amendment gives all African Americans, once enslaved people, citizenship, and this is a huge move forward for the African American community, because now they can go ahead and use their rights to go and use the law in their favor. So one of those things is the Dred Scott decision, which was in the 1820s, where yes, the 1850s, where Dred Scott tried to sue for his freedom because his master died and moved back to Missouri. But unfortunately, the judge at the time said that slaves were not U.S. citizens and did not have the law on their side and could not use it. So the 14th Amendment really repels or nullifies the Dred Scott decision. So now African Americans can go ahead and use the Constitution to go ahead and sue and use it in their advantage to be able to have justice. Sadly, the 15th Amendment had to go ahead and be added because many southern states were not allowing African Americans to enjoy their freedoms as U.S. citizens, which allowed them to vote. So all males, including former slaves, could vote in the United States. And again, if you remember, all males, which means women still did not have the right to vote, and won't see this for another 70 to 80 years. Some impacts of the Reconstruction when you're kind of taking a look at it. Slaves, a huge economic impact would be this group was now being paid for their labor, which is a huge move forward, which means they're no longer slaves, which is the 13th Amendment. A social impact is, the slaves were still being discriminated against, specifically white Southern Democrats, which means we're looking at segregation, racial prejudice, as well as black codes and Jim Crow laws kind of being inputted to restrict the African American community. Some political impacts is the African Americans were able to gain their freedom, able to vote, and have citizenship through the Reconstruction amendments implemented by the radical Republicans. The plantation owners, again, in this time with the 13th Amendment, it destroys the plantation system. So the plantation owners, they had to hire sharecroppers to pay for their workers, but because of how the plantation owners are able to go ahead and construct the sharecroppers, they're able to go ahead and keep the African Americans in a form of servitude, but more economically versus more of a socially contract from before. The social aspects of the plantation owners is many of the abolitionists who are from the North and the Republicans viewed less of the plantation owners and kind of put them down on a lower social ladder. And a political impact would be this group lost political power and was forced to grant freedom to slaves living on their plantation and kind of losing their economic stability. White Southerners with small farms, they were able to go ahead in the beginning, was now competing with newly freed slaves for jobs and land, which really did hurt them. Social impacts was this group formed terrorist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan to scare and oppress African Americans. And political impacts for this particular area was this group lost power and resented the military rule that was implemented by the radical Republicans. So it kind of made things a little bit worse for African American communities at this time. So when we're looking at Reconstruction impacts, we're seeing sharecroppers. And if you kind of take a look at this picture, you can see that these people who are sharecroppers are not really living in great conditions. They're being overworked. They have to go ahead and pay for housing, which is kind of what's behind them. They had to pay for that, as well as renting tools. And, you know, depending on how much what they were able to harvest was sold for, determined how much they got paid. So you could imagine it was not very much, which kept them indebted to their once plantation owners and never really broke the cycle. Just remember that the freed people at this time really had no skills, no education, so they were kind of stuck with the only skill that they knew, which was working on plantations. The Freeman's Bureau was instated by the radical Republicans, and the whole point of this was to go ahead and help out the newly freed people by giving them an education to be able to read, giving them medical assistance as well as food. This was a huge impact for them because it allowed the African American community to go ahead and build up and be able to look at other forms of employment other than working on plantations or working inside of houses. So some other impacts are coming from this area are going to be the prejudice and the racist segregation that's kind of coming in. One of them is going to be the poll taxes. Basically what a poll tax is you had to pay a tax before you went to vote, and you had to show this. These poll taxes were not very easy to pay, and because of the injustices on the jobs available to the African American community, they were not able to afford this. So what this did, it made it very difficult for African Americans to give their vote and exercise their right on voting, which was given to them by the 15th Amendment. We also start to see that there were literacy tests as well as discrimination coming in for voting. Many African Americans were kind of forced to vote a specific way because there was really no protection for them. So we have some other aspects of injustices with the impacts of Reconstruction. Again, the literacy tests, which means that African Americans had to show that they were literate before they could go ahead and show voting. And then you have your Black Codes and Jim Crow laws, which made it very hard for African Americans to break out of poverty and not having the law on their side to kind of protect them. And this continues on until the 1900s and including the 1960s. We're looking at the civil rights movement, which really has a huge impact on the United States because now everything is really being shown on a public scale with television. So this really increases civil rights as well as awareness of what's happening in the South. And we're finishing up with Texas because, again, this is Texas history. And if you remember, inside of the radical Republicans, each state had to go ahead and ratify their constitution, which had to be approved to be able to let them back into the Union. So Texas, after many, many changes of their constitution going through the years, I just kind of wanted to show this. Texas becomes independent, becomes its own country in 1836. In 1845, they become a state and have their own constitution with their own Bill of Rights. After the war is over, Texas creates and becomes a Confederate state, and they have a new constitution, which obviously is going to allow slavery as well as continue on the benefits for the white community. And in 1866, a year after the war, and that Texas had to create a new constitution at the end of the Civil War, the U.S. rejected this constitution because it just did not really go in with what was being looked for the 14th and 15th Amendments. And in 1869, the Reconstruction Constitution, they had to reconstruct it again, adding different parts to their constitution, which eventually comes to 1876, 12 years after the end of the Civil War. The Constitution is rewritten, and it's still the current law that is used today. So again, over time, Texas changed in many ways, making it necessary to write several new constitutions. Today, Texas operates under the Texas Constitution of 1876, which has been amended about 400 times since then. So there have been things that have been ratified. And you can go ahead and look this up, the Texas Constitution, and take a look at it and read it yourself. It's very interesting. We have our own Bill of Rights as well. Well, Timberwolves, it's been a really long time, and I hope you've been able to go ahead and stick with me during this whole entire journey of the Civil War and Reconstruction. This brings an end to my review. I hope it's able to help you and educate you on what you need to know for the Civil War and the test tomorrow. Happy studying and good luck to you.